Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. Today we are beginning an episode that many people across the world are thinking about quietly, discussing seriously in academic circles, and searching for online with curiosity and concern, because it connects directly to the future of jobs, prices, technology, and global influence, even though it often feels too complex to fully understand. The big question we are exploring today is this: will China become the world's economic superpower by 2030? This question is not asked because of drama or competition alone, but because global economic shifts affect ordinary lives in very real ways, and understanding this topic calmly and clearly helps us become more informed global citizens while improving our English at the same time.
Yes, Adam. And I'm really glad you emphasized how personal this topic actually is, because when many listeners hear phrases like economic superpower or global economy, they often think these ideas only matter to governments or big companies. But in reality, they influence the cost of living, job opportunities, education choices, and even the technology people use every day. For English learners especially, this topic can feel intimidating at first, which is why from the very beginning we want to reassure everyone listening that this episode is designed to be slow, clear, and educational, with simple explanations that help listeners feel confident instead of overwhelmed by big global discussions.
That reassurance is extremely important, Julia, because the internet is full of dramatic headlines and strong opinions that often present economic change as a race with winners and losers, even though the real world is far more complex and interconnected. When people ask whether China might become the world's leading economic power, they are often really asking deeper questions about stability, opportunity, and what kind of global system the future might bring, which is why we want to explore this topic carefully, without predictions, fear, or exaggeration, and instead focus on understanding the ideas and language behind the discussion.
Exactly, Adam. And this is where learning English through world topics becomes especially valuable, because understanding global news is not only about vocabulary, but also about tone, balance, and context. Many English learners see news articles or videos about China, the United States, or global competition, and feel confused because the language sounds strong or emotional. So our goal here at the English Globe is to slow everything down and explain what people really mean when they talk about economic power, growth, and influence, using calm language that supports both understanding and critical thinking.
And since this is an educational podcast, Julia, I think it's helpful to clearly explain what we mean by the term economic superpower in simple words, because it does not mean control or domination, but rather strong influence over global trade, production, technology, finance, and decision-making, where a country's economic choices affect many other countries around the world. This influence can shape markets, supply chains, innovation, and even international cooperation, which is why people everywhere are paying close attention to how major economies like China are developing over time.
I agree completely, Adam. And it's also important to remind listeners that asking this question does not mean predicting the future with certainty, because economies change due to many factors such as technology, population trends, education, policy decisions, and global cooperation. Instead, this discussion helps learners understand why experts debate this topic, why opinions differ, and how to listen carefully to different viewpoints without becoming confused or emotionally influenced by extreme claims they might see on social media.
That's a great point, Julia, because one of the main reasons people around the world are asking this question today is China's rapid economic growth over recent decades, which has made it a central part of global manufacturing, trade, and technology development. As China became more connected to international markets, its role in the global economy grew, leading many people to naturally wonder how this growth might continue and what it could mean for the future, especially as the world becomes more economically interconnected than ever before.
And Adam, I think it's also important to speak directly to our listeners here, Because if you are listening right now and thinking that this topic feels too large or difficult, please remember that you do not need advanced economic knowledge to understand the basics. By listening carefully to clear explanations and conversational discussions like this one, you are already building the skills needed to follow international news in English, which can open doors to education, careers, and global understanding in the long term.
Absolutely, Julia. And before we continue deeper into today's discussion, we would like to kindly ask our dear listeners for a small moment of support. Because if you find these calm, clear explanations helpful for improving your English and understanding the world, please like this video and subscribe to the English Globe. Your support helps us continue creating long educational podcasts that focus on real global topics while keeping language learning at the center of everything we do.
Yes, Adam, and we would truly love to hear from you as well, because learning becomes more meaningful when it is shared. Please tell us in the comments where you are listening from today, whether it is from your home, your classroom, your workplace, or while traveling, and feel free to share your thoughts or opinions about today's topic in a respectful and thoughtful way. Writing comments, even simple ones, is a powerful way to practice English and connect with learners from different parts of the world.
And don't worry about making mistakes in your English, because this community is about learning, not perfection, and every sentence you write or understand brings you one step closer to confidence. As we move forward in this episode, we will explore this global question step by step, using clear language, balanced explanations, and an educational approach that helps you improve your listening skills while understanding how global economics quietly shapes everyday life.
So with that calm and curious mindset, Adam, and with our listeners ready to learn, let's continue this journey together, exploring why the question of China's economic future matters to so many people and how understanding it in simple English can help listeners feel more confident, informed, and connected to the world. We're glad you're here with us today on the English Globe.
When we hear the phrase economic superpower, many people immediately imagine something mysterious or overwhelming, as if it describes a hidden force that only experts can understand. But in reality, this term is simply a way to describe a country whose economy has a very strong influence on how money, goods, services, and opportunities move around the world, meaning that decisions made inside that country can affect prices, jobs, investments, and industries far beyond its own borders, which is why understanding this term clearly is an important first step before we analyze any country's future role.
Yes, Adam, and I think it really helps listeners to know that an economic superpower is not about fear or control, but about connection and influence. Because when a country produces many goods, trades with many partners, invests in technology, and plays a major role in global markets, other countries naturally feel the effects of those activities in their daily lives, such as the cost of products, availability of technology, or even job opportunities. And this makes the concept much more relatable than it sounds at first.
Exactly, Julia. And one of the most common indicators people use when discussing economic power is something called GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product. And in simple terms, GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced by a country in a given time period, often 1 year. And while this number helps us understand the size of an economy, it does not tell the full story, because two countries can have similar GDP levels but very different influence on global trade, technology, or financial systems.
That's a very important point, Adam, because many learners hear about GDP rankings and think that the country with the biggest number automatically becomes the most powerful. But in real life, it is more like comparing two people by height alone, because height matters, but it does not tell you about strength, skills, experience, or influence. And in the same way, GDP gives us useful information. But it must be understood together with other indicators to truly explain economic power.
Another key indicator, Julia, is trade. which refers to how much a country buys from and sells to other countries, because a nation that is deeply connected to global trade networks often plays a central role in supply chains, meaning that factories, shipping routes, and businesses around the world depend on its production and consumption. And this dependence creates influence, since disruptions or changes in that country's economy can quickly affect many other economies at the same time.
Yes, and to make this idea more practical for listeners, we can think about everyday products like smartphones, clothing, or household items. Because when a country is involved in producing parts, assembling products, or exporting finished goods on a large scale, people everywhere notice changes in prices or availability, which shows that economic power is not only about money stored inside a country, but also about how connected that country is to the global flow of goods and services.
Another very important indicator is currency, which simply means the money a country uses, because some currencies are used widely in international trade, savings, and investment, allowing countries to buy and sell goods more easily across borders. And when a currency is trusted and used globally, it increases a country's economic influence by making its financial system more central to global economic activity.
That's right, Adam. And for English learners, it helps to remember that currency power is about trust and stability. Because when businesses and governments feel confident using a particular currency, they are more willing to trade, invest, and save using that money, which means the country behind that currency becomes more influential, not because of force, but because others choose to participate in its financial system.
Innovation is another crucial part of economic superpower status, Julia, because countries that invest in research, education, and technology often create new products, services, and ideas that shape global markets. And when a country leads in innovation, it does not just sell goods, but also sets standards, influences industries, and attracts talent from around the world, which strengthens its long-term economic position beyond simple production numbers.
I really like that point, Adam, because innovation shows why economic power is not fixed or permanent, since countries that continue to learn, adapt, and develop new technologies can increase their influence over time, while those that fail to invest in education or innovation may struggle, even if they were once very powerful. And this helps learners understand that economic leadership is a process, not a single achievement.
Another idea we must explain clearly is influence, which means the ability of a country's economic decisions to shape global rules, standards, and behavior. Because when a country is economically influential, its policies, regulations, and business practices often become models that others follow, either because they are effective or because global markets depend on them, and this kind of influence can quietly shape the global system over many years.
Yes, Adam. And this is where it becomes helpful to explain the difference between political power and economic power. Because political power is about government authority, laws, and diplomacy, while economic power is about production, trade, finance, and innovation. And although these two types of power often interact, they are not the same, which means a country can be politically strong without being economically dominant, or economically influential without controlling global politics.
That distinction is very important, Julia, because many people mix these ideas together and assume that political influence automatically means economic leadership, when in reality, economic power often comes from long-term investment, cooperation, and trust built through markets and institutions, rather than direct political decisions alone, and understanding this difference helps learners analyze global topics more carefully and logically.
And Adam, I think it's also helpful to remind listeners that population size alone does not decide economic power. Because while having a large population can provide a big workforce and consumer market, it must be supported by education, productivity, infrastructure, and opportunity. Otherwise, size alone does not create strong economic influence, which is why smaller countries with advanced technology or financial systems can sometimes have an outsized role in the global economy.
Absolutely, Julia. And this brings us back to the central idea of this section, which is that an economic superpower is defined by a combination of factors working together, including GDP, trade connections, currency influence, innovation, and the ability to shape global economic behavior, rather than any single number or headline. And by understanding these concepts clearly, listeners are better prepared to follow the rest of our discussion without confusion.
I agree completely, Adam. Because once learners understand these basic terms and ideas, global economic discussions stop feeling abstract and start feeling meaningful, as they can connect what they hear in the news to real-life examples, everyday products, and personal experiences, which is exactly why learning English through global topics like this helps build both language skills and global awareness at the same time.
So as we move forward, Julia, we encourage our listeners to keep these definitions in mind because they form the foundation for understanding any discussion about economic leadership. And by listening carefully and noticing how these words are used in context, you are not only learning about the world, but also strengthening your ability to understand complex ideas in clear, practical English. To understand why so many people today ask whether China could become the world's leading economic power, we first need to calmly look back at how China's economy changed over recent decades. Because this story is not about one sudden moment or one single decision, but about a long process of gradual growth, learning, and adaptation that unfolded step by step, especially from the late 20th century onward, when China began to open more of its economy to global trade, investment, and industrial development in a careful and controlled way.
Adam, when you say over recent decades, I think many listeners might wonder what that really means in simple terms, because for English learners it can be difficult to connect long historical timelines with everyday understanding. So could you explain roughly how this growth started and why it became so noticeable to the rest of the world?
That's a great question, Julia, and a very natural one, because China's economic rise did not happen overnight, but became more visible as the country slowly increased production, encouraged manufacturing, and allowed more connections with international markets, which meant that factories began producing goods not only for local use, but also for export to other countries, leading to steady growth in jobs, skills, and industrial capacity over many years.
So if I understand correctly, Adam, one key part of this story is manufacturing. Because when people talk about China's economy, they often mention factories and production, and many listeners may be curious why manufacturing played such a central role in China's development compared to some other countries.
Exactly, Julia. Manufacturing became a foundation of China's economic growth because producing goods at large scale allowed the country to participate actively in global trade, especially as international companies looked for places where production could be organized efficiently, supported by a large workforce and improving infrastructure, which gradually helped China develop skills, supply chains, and experience that strengthened its position in the global economy.
That explanation really helps, Adam, because it shows that manufacturing is not just about machines and factories, but also about learning how to manage production, transportation, and coordination on a very large scale, which is something that takes time and organization. And I think this is where many listeners start to hear the phrase, the world's factory connected to China.
You're absolutely right, Julia. And the term, the world's factory, emerged because China became deeply involved in producing a wide range of goods used by people all over the world, from everyday household items to more complex products. And this role developed as global companies invested in Chinese manufacturing, bringing capital, technology, and management experience, while China provided labor, facilities, and growing logistical networks that supported large-scale production.
When you mention global companies and investment, Adam, it makes me think that China's rise was not something that happened in isolation, but rather through cooperation and connection with the global economy, which might surprise some listeners who imagine economic growth as a purely national effort.
That's an important observation, Julia, because global trade and foreign investment played a significant role in China's development, as companies from different countries invested in factories, partnerships, and supply chains, while China became an important trading partner by exporting goods and importing resources, technology, and knowledge, creating a two-way relationship that supported growth on both sides.
I think that two-way idea is very helpful for learners, Adam, because it shows that economic growth is often based on cooperation rather than competition alone, and that countries can grow by becoming reliable partners in global trade networks rather than acting independently.
Exactly, Julia. And another crucial element that supported this growth was infrastructure, which includes roads, ports, railways, and power systems. Because without efficient ways to move goods, people, and resources, manufacturing and trade cannot function smoothly. So China invested heavily over time in building and improving infrastructure that allowed factories to connect with ports and global shipping routes more efficiently.
So in simple words, Adam, we could say that strong infrastructure helped connect production to the rest of the world, making it easier for goods to travel from factories to international markets, which then reinforced China's role in global trade.
Yes, that's a very clear way to put it, Julia. Because infrastructure acted like the foundation under the entire system, supporting manufacturing, exports, and investment. And as these systems improved, they made China a more attractive place for production and trade, which in turn encouraged further growth and development over time.
Adam, some listeners might also wonder why exports became such an important part of this story, especially since not all countries focus so strongly on selling goods abroad. So how would you explain the role of exports in China's economic rise in simple terms?
Exports became important because selling goods to international markets allowed China to earn income from global demand, while also helping industries grow larger and more efficient through experience and scale, meaning that as factories produced more for international customers, they improved quality, reduced costs, and developed skills that strengthened the overall economy, creating a cycle of growth that continued for many years.
That makes a lot of sense, Adam, because it shows how learning by doing can shape an economy, and it also helps listeners understand why China's growth attracted so much global attention, especially as its products became common in households around the world.
Yes, Julia, and it's important to emphasize that this process involved gradual change rather than sudden transformation, because China's economic rise was built through long-term planning, experimentation, and adaptation, learning from both successes and challenges along the way, which is why understanding this history helps us better understand current discussions without emotion or exaggeration.
I really appreciate that calm perspective, Adam, because it reminds listeners that economic development is usually complex and slow, not dramatic or simple, and that looking at history carefully allows us to understand present-day questions more clearly.
Exactly, Julia. And by understanding how manufacturing, exports, infrastructure, and global trade worked together over time, listeners can see why China became such an important part of the global economy, without seeing this story as political or controversial, but rather as an example of how economies evolve through connection, investment, and long-term effort.
So to gently summarize for our listeners, Adam, we can say that China's economic rise happened through decades of manufacturing growth, expanding exports, strong infrastructure development, and deep involvement in global trade and investment, which together helped shape its role as a major economic player in the world today.
That's a perfect summary, Julia. And keeping this historical context in mind will help our listeners better understand the next sections of our discussion, as we continue exploring global economic questions in a clear, balanced, and educational way here on the English Globe. When experts talk about China's current economic strengths, they usually begin with the idea of the domestic market, because China has a very large population that participates in buying, selling, and consuming goods and services every day, which means companies inside the country are not only producing for export, but also serving millions of local customers, creating steady internal demand that can support businesses even during times when global trade slows down, and this large domestic market is often seen as an advantage because it allows economic activity to continue within the country itself rather than depending completely on foreign buyers.
That idea of a domestic market can sound abstract, Adam. So for listeners, it might help to imagine daily life examples. Because when millions of people buy phones, clothes, food, and services inside one country, businesses have more reasons to invest, create jobs, and improve products, which then feeds back into the economy, showing a clear cause and effect relationship between population size, consumer demand, and economic stability that learners can easily relate to their own experiences as customers.
Another strength often discussed is manufacturing capacity, which refers to the ability to produce large quantities of goods efficiently and consistently. Because over many years, China developed factories, supply chains, and management systems that can handle production at massive scale, allowing companies to respond quickly to demand, control costs, and deliver products reliably. And this capacity continues to be an economic advantage because it supports both domestic needs and international trade without relying on a single industry or product type.
To connect this with everyday life, Adam, many listeners may notice that products they use daily, such as household items, electronics, or clothing, are often made or assembled in China. And this is not only about low cost, but also about the ability to produce complex products on time and in large numbers, which helps learners understand how manufacturing capacity directly affects availability, pricing, and even innovation in products they interact with regularly.
Technology development is another area where experts see opportunity, because China has increased investment in research, digital systems, and modern industries, supporting growth in areas such as e-commerce, digital payments, and advanced manufacturing, which allows the economy to move beyond basic production toward higher-value activities. And this shift is important because economies that develop technology tend to increase productivity and competitiveness over the long term.
Yes. And from a daily life perspective, Adam, technology development becomes visible when people use online platforms, digital services, or smart devices that make tasks faster and more convenient, showing learners how investment in technology can change how people shop, work, communicate, and even learn languages, which helps them see why experts connect innovation with economic strength.
Infrastructure and logistics also play a major role, because efficient transportation networks, ports, railways, and digital systems make it easier to move goods and information quickly across large distances, reducing delays and costs for businesses. And when infrastructure functions smoothly, it supports manufacturing, trade, and services at the same time, strengthening the overall economic system without drawing attention to itself.
For listeners, Adam, this can be imagined as the difference between a smooth road and a broken one. Because when transportation works well, products arrive faster, services improve, and companies can plan more confidently, showing a clear cause and effect link between infrastructure investment and economic efficiency that learners can connect to their own travel or delivery experiences.
Finally, education and workforce scale are often mentioned as long-term strengths, because having a large number of workers with improving education and skills allows an economy to support different industries, adapt to change, and develop new capabilities over time. And while education systems take years to show results, they help build human capital, which is essential for sustaining growth beyond manufacturing alone.
To gently summarize for our listeners, Adam, these strengths work together rather than separately, because a large domestic market supports businesses, manufacturing capacity supplies goods, technology increases efficiency, infrastructure connects everything, and education prepares workers for future challenges, helping learners understand that economic opportunity is created through systems working together, not one single advantage acting alone.
As we continue this discussion, it is important to keep a balanced and realistic view, because every large economy, no matter how successful it appears, also faces challenges that can slow growth or create uncertainty. and China is no exception to this pattern, which is why experts who study global economics always look not only at strengths and opportunities, but also at risks and difficulties that may affect the future, especially when discussing long-term questions such as economic leadership or sustainability.
I'm really glad you said that, Adam, because many listeners might think that talking about challenges means something is going wrong or failing. But in reality, challenges are a normal part of economic development, especially for very large and complex economies. And understanding them calmly helps learners develop critical thinking skills instead of reacting emotionally to dramatic headlines they may see online.
One of the most discussed challenges is China's aging population, which simply means that over time, the number of older people in the country is increasing compared to the number of younger people entering the workforce, and this matters economically because a smaller working-age population can reduce labor supply, slow productivity growth, and increase pressure on social systems, making it more difficult to maintain the same pace of economic expansion as in earlier decades.
To make that clearer for listeners, Adam, we can think of it like a workplace where fewer new workers are joining while more experienced workers are retiring. Because this can change how companies plan for the future, how governments manage healthcare and pensions, and how societies think about productivity, showing that population trends are not just statistics, but real factors that influence everyday economic decisions.
Another area experts often mention is debt, which refers to money borrowed by governments, companies, or households to invest, grow, or manage expenses. And while debt can support development when used carefully, high levels of debt can become a concern if economic growth slows, because it may limit future spending options or increase financial pressure, especially in large economies where many sectors are interconnected.
That explanation is very helpful, Adam, because many learners hear the word debt and immediately think of danger. But it's important to understand that debt itself is not always negative, and what really matters is how manageable it is, how it is used, and whether the economy can continue to grow and generate income to support it, which encourages listeners to think more deeply instead of reacting to simple labels.
Closely connected to debt concerns is the property market, which includes housing and real estate development, because in many economies, property plays a major role in investment, savings, and local government finance, and when property prices rise too quickly or construction outpaces demand, it can create financial stress, requiring careful management to avoid long-term instability or reduced confidence among businesses and consumers.
For everyday understanding, Adam, many listeners can relate to this through housing prices in their own countries. Because when homes become too expensive, or when construction slows, people may delay buying, companies may reduce investment, and overall economic activity can feel less dynamic, helping learners see how property markets connect directly to people's lives and broader economic health.
Another factor that receives global attention is trade tension, which refers to disagreements or uncertainty between trading partners about rules, tariffs, or market access. And while trade tensions are not unusual in the global system, they can affect export growth, investment decisions, and supply chains, especially for economies that are deeply involved in international trade like China, making flexibility and adaptation especially important.
I think it's important to stress, Adam, that trade tensions do not mean global trade stops or collapses, but rather that countries sometimes renegotiate relationships or adjust policies. And for learners, this is a good reminder that the global economy is dynamic, with periods of cooperation and adjustment, not a fixed system that moves in only one direction.
Finally, many experts discuss the risk of economic slowdown, which simply means that growth may become slower compared to earlier years, especially as an economy becomes larger and more developed, and this is actually a common pattern worldwide, because rapid growth is often easier at earlier stages, while maintaining high growth over time requires innovation, efficiency, and careful management of resources.
That point is very reassuring for listeners, Adam, because it shows that slower growth does not automatically mean failure, but rather a transition to a different stage of development, where quality, stability, and sustainability become as important as speed. And this helps learners understand economic news with patience rather than fear.
Taken together, these challenges, aging population, debt management, property market issues, trade adjustments, and slower growth risks, do not define China's future on their own, but they do shape the environment in which decisions are made, and understanding them calmly allows listeners to see why experts often disagree on long-term predictions, while still respecting the complexity of the global economy.
I completely agree, Adam. And for our listeners, the key lesson here is not to panic or jump to conclusions, but to recognize that every major economy faces both opportunities and challenges at the same time. And by learning how to listen carefully, analyze information, and understand cause and effect relationships in English, they are building skills that go far beyond this single topic.
So as we move forward in this episode, we encourage everyone listening to keep this balanced perspective in mind, remembering that economic discussions are rarely simple or absolute, and that learning to understand challenges calmly is just as important as recognizing strengths, especially when exploring global questions in a thoughtful and educational way here on the English Globe. When we discuss global economic competition today, it is essential to calmly look at the role of the United States, not as a rival or enemy to anyone, but as an example of how a highly developed economy functions in the modern world, because the United States continues to hold significant influence over global finance, trade, and innovation, and this influence is reflected in many areas, including the widespread use of its currency in international transactions, the leadership of its companies in technology and services, and the continued ability of its financial institutions to shape global markets, which allows learners to understand that economic power is multifaceted and not only measured by total GDP or production numbers.
Yes, Adam. And for many listeners, it helps to see this in practical terms, because the US dollar is often used in global trade, savings, and investment, meaning that when a company in another country sells goods to a foreign buyer, it frequently prices transactions in dollars, and when countries hold foreign reserves, they often keep a large portion in dollars to ensure stability, which shows learners that currency influence is a form of economic leadership that operates quietly but consistently in everyday business and international trade.
Another way to look at U.S. influence is through innovation and entrepreneurship, because many of the largest technology companies, research institutions, and financial organizations are headquartered in the United States, which allows the country to create products, services, and systems that are used worldwide. And this leadership is not just about producing goods, but about setting global standards, attracting talent from other countries, and encouraging ideas that spread across borders, demonstrating that economic leadership often combines creativity, investment, and international cooperation rather than relying solely on size or population.
Exactly, Adam. And for English learners, it is helpful to connect this idea to daily life, because when we use smartphones, software, online services, or watch movies produced by US companies, we are participating in an economy that influences global trends, which shows how innovation and influence can extend far beyond financial numbers and production statistics, making it easier for learners to see cause and effect in the global system and understand why economic power is complex and multidimensional.
It is also important to note that global economic leadership is not defined solely by GDP, because while the United States has a large economy in terms of production, its influence comes equally from finance, intellectual property, education, and technological infrastructure, which means that countries can be very influential even if they do not have the largest population or the fastest-growing economy. And this helps listeners understand that leadership in the global economy is a combination of size, efficiency, innovation, and the ability to create trust and stability in international markets, rather than a simple competition of numbers.
That distinction is very important, Adam, because many learners may assume that being first in GDP automatically translates to economic dominance. But in reality, leadership also depends on the strength of institutions, the ability to innovate, and the stability of financial systems, which is why even smaller countries can have a strong influence in specific industries or markets, showing learners that economic power can take different forms and that comparing countries is more about understanding differences than declaring winners or losers.
In addition, the United States has developed a global network of investment, trade relationships, and educational institutions that support its economic role in ways that are often subtle but long-lasting. Because universities train leaders who work internationally, companies create products used across continents, and financial markets allow global investors to participate in US-based projects, which together reinforce influence without the need for conflict, demonstrating that economic power is often built through systems, trust, and cooperation rather than competition alone.
Yes, Adam. And for learners, it helps to see this as an example of how economies operate in a connected world, because trade, currency use, and innovation create a network of interactions that affect daily life even far from the United States, such as when imported goods arrive at local stores, online services reach distant users, or multinational companies hire people from many countries, which shows that economic influence is everywhere. And learning about it in English also builds vocabulary and critical thinking skills simultaneously.
Finally, it is useful to recognize that the U.S. economy faces its own challenges, just as China does, including issues related to debt, inequality, and maintaining growth, which demonstrates to learners that no economy is perfect or guaranteed to maintain influence indefinitely, and that understanding global economics requires careful observation, analysis of trends, and appreciation for multiple factors, because leadership is earned through stability, adaptability, and sustained innovation rather than being automatically given by history, geography, or size alone.
So to summarize, Adam, for our listeners, the current role of the United States shows that economic power is about more than raw numbers, because it combines currency influence, innovation, financial networks, education, and global trust. And by looking at these elements carefully and neutrally, learners can understand differences between countries without seeing them as opponents, which encourages critical thinking, informed analysis, and a broader understanding of how global economics operates in everyday life.
Exactly, Julia. And as we move forward in this episode, keeping this comparison in mind will help our listeners see how China's rise and the United States' established position interact in a global context, while remembering that learning English through these discussions strengthens not only vocabulary and comprehension, but also the ability to understand complex, nuanced ideas about international economics, preparing learners to participate thoughtfully in global conversations without fear, judgment, or oversimplification. When we look at the global economy today, it is very important for listeners to understand that it is not simply a story about China and the United States, because the world is much more interconnected and diverse, with many countries contributing to economic growth, innovation, and trade in ways that influence global markets. And this means that to fully understand questions about future economic leadership, we must expand our perspective to include Europe, India, Japan, and a range of emerging economies, because these players, individually and collectively, shape trends, provide investment, and create opportunities that no single country can achieve alone, which helps English learners see that global economics is about networks, partnerships, and interactions, rather than a simple competition between two nations.
That's a very useful point, Adam, because when we talk about Europe, for example, listeners may think only of individual countries like Germany, France, or the United Kingdom. But in reality, Europe acts as a region with significant combined economic power, particularly through trade agreements, shared currency in the Eurozone, and collaboration on technology and finance, which means that decisions made in European markets, banking systems, and industries can ripple across the world, influencing production, investment, and innovation. And this helps learners connect abstract concepts like regional influence to concrete examples they may notice in everyday news, imports, and global services.
Exactly, Julia. And India is another country that demonstrates how emerging economies contribute to the global picture. Because with a large and young population, rapidly expanding technology and service sectors, and increasing participation in international trade, India shows that economic growth is not only about past achievements, but also about future potential, which is why many analysts now include India as a significant player when discussing a multipolar economy, meaning an economic system in which influence is distributed among multiple countries rather than concentrated in one dominant power. And understanding this concept allows learners to see that global economics is dynamic, adaptive, and shaped by multiple actors acting simultaneously in different sectors.
That idea of a multipolar economy, Adam, can be explained simply for learners by imagining a classroom where no single student controls all the decisions, but instead several students contribute ideas, influence group choices, and collaborate to achieve outcomes, which mirrors the global economy. Because even if one country produces a lot or invests heavily, the actions of other countries, through trade, innovation, investment, or policy, can change outcomes, create opportunities, or reduce risks, which reinforces the idea that economic leadership is shared, interdependent, and constantly negotiated.
Japan is also an important example, Julia, because although its population is smaller than China or India, it has highly advanced technology, global brands, and strong infrastructure, and its role in global trade, innovation, and investment demonstrates that economic influence does not depend solely on size or raw resources, but also on efficiency, quality, and the ability to maintain global relationships. And this is why Japan continues to be a critical partner for both Western and Asian economies, showing learners that leadership in certain sectors can coexist with other players' influence, rather than replacing it entirely.
Yes, and looking beyond these well-known countries, emerging markets in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia also play important roles, because they provide natural resources, labor, growing consumer markets, and investment opportunities that affect global supply chains and pricing, which means that even smaller or developing economies can shape global economic trends. And for English learners, this demonstrates that economics is not just about big countries, but about interaction, collaboration, and interdependence across diverse regions, encouraging learners to think globally and use new vocabulary to describe complex systems.
Another key point, Julia, is that economic influence today often depends on cooperation rather than direct competition, because countries frequently participate in multinational trade agreements, joint technology projects, global banking systems, and investment networks that distribute risk and opportunity across borders, meaning that the global economy is increasingly interconnected, and decisions made by one player, even a large one, can be influenced by others' policies, regulations, and innovations, which helps listeners see that shared leadership is a natural feature of the modern world, rather than a weakness or limitation for any individual country.
That's very helpful for learners, Adam, because it shows that global vocabulary, like multipolar, interconnected, and collaboration, is not just academic, but directly explains real-world situations such as trade agreements, technology sharing, or financial partnerships. And understanding these terms in context allows learners to follow global news with more confidence while recognizing that the world operates through networks of influence rather than unilateral control, which reinforces both language and critical thinking skills.
It is also important to note that the future may not feature a single economic leader in the way many people imagine, because growth, technology, trade, and finance are spread across multiple regions, and each country brings unique advantages and challenges to the table. So predicting a single winner ignores the reality of shared responsibility, global cooperation, and interconnected markets. And explaining this carefully helps listeners develop a realistic view of global economics while avoiding sensationalism, fear, or oversimplification, which is especially important for educational content that supports English learning.
Exactly, Adam. And for learners, this section reinforces the idea that global economics involves understanding relationships, cause and effect, and different types of influence, rather than memorizing rankings or assuming conflict. Because being able to describe how Europe, India, Japan, and emerging markets contribute to the global system not only builds vocabulary, but also strengthens comprehension of news, reports, and discussions in English about international trade, investment, and development.
So in summary, Julia, this section teaches listeners that the world economy is not a simple story of China versus the United States, but a complex, multipolar system where Europe, India, Japan, and emerging markets each contribute significant influence. And by recognizing shared leadership, cooperation, and interdependence, learners gain a broader understanding of global economics while practicing English in a meaningful, real-world context that connects vocabulary to concepts and concepts to daily life, preparing them to analyze future developments thoughtfully and clearly.
Yes, Adam. And remembering that global influence is distributed among many countries helps our listeners think critically, avoid oversimplification, and see opportunities for learning, collaboration, and dialogue, which are essential skills for understanding both English and international economics. And by reflecting on these ideas, learners can continue building language, knowledge, and confidence as they follow global events and participate in conversations about the world in a calm, informed, and constructive way.
With this understanding, Julia, our listeners are better equipped to see that the future economy is shaped by multiple actors, and that economic power is shared, dynamic, and influenced by cooperation, innovation, and trade networks, which reinforces the educational purpose of this podcast while strengthening English listening skills, global awareness, and the ability to think critically about complex international topics in a balanced, safe, and professional manner here on the English globe. As we move into the heart of today's discussion, it is important to address the question that everyone has been curious about in recent years, which is whether China could become the world's #1 economic power by 2030. And we want to approach this carefully and responsibly, because predicting the future of a global economy is never straightforward, and even experts often have different opinions depending on which factors they emphasize, whether it is GDP size, technological innovation, trade influence, currency use, or global partnerships. And by exploring multiple perspectives, we can provide learners with a balanced understanding without resorting to certainty or sensationalism, showing that global economics is complex and requires careful thought.
Yes, Adam, and for our listeners, it is important to remember that uncertainty in economics is normal, because the world is dynamic, influenced by changing markets, policy decisions, technological breakthroughs, demographic shifts, and even unforeseen events like pandemics or geopolitical tensions, which means that no prediction, however well-informed, can guarantee a single outcome. And learning to think critically about these possibilities is just as important as knowing current statistics or rankings, because it encourages flexibility in reasoning, understanding vocabulary about trends, and forming informed opinions in English about complex global issues.
Many experts agree on certain points when discussing China's potential to reach #1, such as recognizing that the country has the world's second-largest economy in terms of nominal GDP, one of the largest domestic markets with over 1.4 billion people, a highly skilled manufacturing base, and growing technology sectors, and these factors give China substantial advantages that make it a serious contender for long-term economic leadership, while also demonstrating that leadership is multifaceted, involving production, innovation, trade, infrastructure, and workforce development, which are concepts that English learners can connect to concrete examples like factories, technology products, and daily consumer goods they encounter.
Exactly, Adam. And it is helpful for learners to think of these advantages as real-world tools that countries use to influence the global economy. Because when a country produces a large number of goods efficiently, invests in technology and education, and maintains strong infrastructure, it can shape trade, supply chains, and even international standards, which are subtle ways of demonstrating leadership that go beyond simple GDP rankings, helping listeners understand that being number one is a combination of factors rather than a single statistic, and that language like influence, capacity, and innovation has practical meaning in global economics.
At the same time, experts disagree on what number one actually means, because some focus on GDP alone, while others emphasize per capita wealth, technological innovation, global trade influence, or even financial and currency dominance, which leads to different conclusions about whether China could reach the top position by 2030. And it is crucial for listeners to understand that these differences are not contradictions, but reflect the complexity of measuring economic power, and learning these terms and distinctions can help English learners discuss global economics accurately and confidently.
Yes, Adam. And this disagreement reminds listeners that global economics is full of nuance, because a country could lead in manufacturing but not in financial influence, or dominate certain technologies but have slower growth in services or education. And by examining these different dimensions, learners gain not only English vocabulary, but also the ability to interpret news articles, research reports, and expert commentary critically, seeing that leadership in the global economy is not absolute, but relative, conditional, and dependent on many interacting factors, which encourages thoughtful analysis instead of simple answers.
Another reason why predictions about China's economic position are uncertain is that the future depends on many unpredictable variables, including domestic policy decisions, population trends, environmental challenges, global trade dynamics, technological breakthroughs, and international cooperation, which means that even the most sophisticated economic models must acknowledge margins of error, alternative scenarios, and potential disruptions. And for listeners, this uncertainty can be reassuring because it shows that experts are careful, that conclusions are always provisional, and that thinking critically and calmly is more valuable than assuming inevitability.
For learners, Adam, this uncertainty also demonstrates an important life skill, because in English and in real-world thinking, it is necessary to express probabilities, weigh evidence, and use language that conveys possibility rather than certainty, such as may, could, potentially, and likely, which helps learners describe complex global issues responsibly and accurately, and reinforces the educational purpose of this podcast, which is to combine language learning with informed understanding of current world topics in a professional and accessible way.
It is also useful to consider that different ways of measuring number one will lead to different answers, because some analysts look at total GDP in nominal terms. Others consider purchasing power parity. Some measure technological leadership or innovation indices, while others focus on global influence, currency dominance, or investment capacity. And all of these metrics offer valuable insight, which helps learners understand that global economics is multidimensional, and that each measure emphasizes a different aspect of influence, encouraging nuanced thinking rather than oversimplification.
Exactly, Adam. And this is where open thinking becomes essential for learners, because it encourages curiosity, questions, and discussion, rather than passively accepting headlines or rankings. And by comparing different perspectives, learners practice analytical skills in English, explore vocabulary like metrics, indices, and influence, and gain confidence in discussing complex ideas about the economy in ways that are safe, neutral, and educational, which aligns perfectly with the goals of the English Globe.
So, to summarize, while China possesses strengths that make it a serious contender for a leading global economic role, predictions about whether it will become number one by 2030 remain uncertain due to multiple factors, differing measures of leadership, and the dynamic nature of the global economy. And presenting these multiple viewpoints calmly and clearly allows learners to see the complexity of international economics while strengthening both vocabulary and comprehension in English, which is the central purpose of this podcast.
And for our listeners, the key takeaway is that uncertainty is normal and valuable because it encourages critical thinking, careful observation, and open discussion. And by understanding both the areas of agreement and disagreement among experts, learners can follow news about China, the United States, and other global players with a balanced perspective, while continuing to improve English listening, comprehension, and analytical skills in a calm, professional, and safe learning environment here on the English Globe.
With this careful approach, Julia, we have explored the main question thoughtfully, recognizing strengths, challenges, disagreements, and uncertainties, which prepares our listeners to engage with global economic news responsibly, apply new vocabulary, and develop critical thinking skills, while remembering that language learning through real-world topics is both practical and empowering, allowing everyone to discuss the future of the global economy with clarity, balance, and confidence in English. As we reach this part of our discussion, it is important to consider not only the big numbers, global rankings, or debates among economists, but also what these changes in the world economy actually mean for ordinary people like you and me. Because even though topics like China's rise, the United States' influence, and global multipolar dynamics may seem distant or abstract, they affect everyday life in ways that touch jobs, prices, technology, education, and opportunities. And understanding these connections helps learners see that economic trends are not just numbers on a chart, but factors that influence the choices, options, and stability of families, communities, and individuals around the world.
Yes, Adam, and I think it's very important to remind our listeners that this is where economics becomes personal, because for someone learning English or trying to grow in their career, global shifts can create new opportunities as well as challenges, and being aware of these trends helps people prepare for change rather than feel surprised by it. Because when countries like China grow economically, invest in technology, and expand their workforce skills, it can influence job markets in other countries through trade, outsourcing, innovation, and competition. Which means that understanding global dynamics calmly and clearly helps learners make informed decisions about their own future, education, and career.
To give a practical example, when an economy grows or changes, it can affect jobs in multiple ways, because industries may expand, contract, or move to different countries. Technology may replace some tasks while creating new ones, and the demand for certain skills, including English communication, digital literacy, and critical thinking, increases, which is why learning English today is not just about language itself, but about connecting to a global network of opportunities, communicating with colleagues and clients across borders, accessing educational resources, and participating in international business or knowledge exchange, all of which empower individuals in a world that is increasingly interconnected.
Absolutely, Adam. And this is why learners should feel motivated. Because each new word, phrase, or skill in English builds their ability to understand news, follow trends, interact with people from other countries, and access opportunities in business, education, or online work. Which means that language learning is directly connected to economic awareness. Because being able to read, listen, or speak in English allows individuals to participate in discussions about innovation, trade, and technology, rather than feeling excluded from conversations that affect decisions at the national and global level, helping learners realize the real-world value of their study.
Another important area is prices, and the cost of living. Because global economic changes influence supply chains, trade agreements, and production costs, which in turn can affect how much people pay for goods, services, and technology, meaning that understanding global markets helps listeners see why prices fluctuate and how international trends relate to everyday decisions about what to buy, save, or invest in. And this is a crucial insight for anyone trying to make reasoned choices in their personal life while also improving English vocabulary related to economics, commerce, and finance.
Yes, Adam, and education and skills are equally vital. Because as economies evolve, employers increasingly value critical thinking, creativity, adaptability, and language skills. And English often becomes the common tool that allows people to access global knowledge, communicate in professional settings, and stay up to date with technological and scientific developments, which means that every hour spent learning English is an investment not only in language ability, but in career resilience, employability, and the capacity to navigate a changing world with confidence and competence.
Technology is another area where ordinary people feel the impact directly, because innovations developed in one part of the world can quickly become essential tools in daily life elsewhere. From smartphones and apps to online services, digital payments, and remote work platforms, and this constant flow of technological advancement affects the skills people need, the speed of business, and the way society functions. So understanding these trends helps listeners recognize that being informed about global economics is not just abstract learning, but a practical way to anticipate and adapt to changes that influence daily life, career paths, and personal growth.
Exactly, Adam. And I want to encourage our listeners to see this as an opportunity, because by learning English and engaging with global topics, they are developing both knowledge and confidence, which allows them to make informed choices, communicate across cultures, and explore opportunities that may not be immediately obvious in their local environment, which reinforces the idea that language learning is not only a skill, but a bridge to understanding the world, accessing information, and participating meaningfully in a global society.
Finally, it is essential to recognize that with every opportunity comes challenges, because global economic change may create competition, require adaptation, and demand new skills, but understanding these dynamics calmly allows ordinary people to plan, prepare, and take advantage of possibilities rather than feeling overwhelmed. And for learners of English, the key takeaway is that language, knowledge of global trends, and critical thinking together create empowerment, giving people the tools to respond thoughtfully to economic changes, pursue international collaboration, and grow personally and professionally in a world where economic leadership, technology, and education are constantly evolving.
So, in summary, Adam, what this means for ordinary people is that global economics is not distant or irrelevant, but connected to jobs, prices, technology, education, and personal opportunities. And by learning English, following developments calmly, and thinking critically, our listeners can prepare themselves to participate confidently in global conversations, understand trends, make informed decisions, and take advantage of opportunities in a changing world, which is exactly the kind of practical, empowering knowledge the English Globe aims to provide.
Yes, Julia. And by linking English learning to global awareness, our listeners can see that every step they take in improving their language skills contributes not only to personal growth, but also to understanding international economics, connecting with others, and navigating a world that is increasingly complex, interconnected, and full of potential, which makes the study of English meaningful, relevant, and directly tied to real-life impact, showing that knowledge, language, and awareness together create opportunities for success, resilience, and participation in the global community.
And with that mindset, dear listeners, we hope you feel motivated to continue your English learning journey while exploring world events, because understanding the global economy, thinking critically, and developing language skills go hand in hand, preparing you not only to follow news about countries like China, the United States, Europe, and India, but also to connect ideas, communicate clearly, and confidently participate in discussions that matter for your career, education, and daily life, which is the ultimate purpose of this podcast here on the English Globe.
As we reach the conclusion of today's episode, it is essential to take a calm and thoughtful look back at what we have discussed together, because this podcast is designed to be fully educational, focused on helping you understand global economic topics while improving your English listening and comprehension skills. And we want to reassure everyone that all the information presented has been shared in a neutral, factual, and professional manner, strictly for learning purposes, so listeners can feel safe exploring these topics without encountering sensationalism, bias, or speculation, which is particularly important when discussing questions about China, the United States, and the complex, interconnected global economy in a way that is appropriate for YouTube and educational content.
Yes, Adam. And as we reflect on today's discussion, I want to remind all our listeners that the world economy is a complex, multipolar system where no single country can define the entire future alone, and we explored the rise of China, the established role of the United States, and the contributions of Europe, India, Japan, and emerging markets, emphasizing that leadership is measured in many ways, including GDP, innovation, technology, trade influence, workforce skills, and global collaboration. And by understanding these factors calmly and systematically, learners can see that global economics is not just about numbers, but about how decisions, policies, and opportunities ripple through everyday life in ways that affect jobs, prices, education, and technology for ordinary people everywhere.
Exactly, Julia. And we also highlighted that while China's growth is impressive, predicting whether it will become the #1 economic power by 2030 involves uncertainty. Because multiple factors, such as domestic policies, demographics, technological progress, global trade relations, and unforeseen events, can change outcomes in ways that are impossible to know in advance. And by presenting different expert viewpoints in a neutral and educational way, listeners can appreciate that global economic discussions are nuanced, require critical thinking, and should always be approached with calm observation rather than assumptions, which is a key skill not only for understanding economics, but also for strengthening English comprehension and analytical ability.
Yes, Adam. And for learners, this episode has shown that English learning and global awareness go hand in hand, because by listening to discussions about economic trends, currency influence, international trade, technological advancement, and workforce dynamics, learners not only build vocabulary and practice comprehension, but also develop the ability to analyze real-world situations thoughtfully, ask questions, and participate in conversations about topics that are meaningful and relevant, all in a safe, professional, and structured environment that encourages curiosity and confidence rather than anxiety or confusion.
We also discussed how these global economic developments affect ordinary people, including their work, daily life, education, and access to technology, demonstrating that economics is not just about abstract numbers, but directly connected to opportunities and challenges that individuals experience. And by understanding these impacts, learners can see the practical relevance of global knowledge, which reinforces why combining English learning with discussions about world topics is a valuable approach, because it simultaneously builds language skills, critical thinking, and informed perspectives that will benefit listeners in both professional and personal contexts.
Absolutely, Adam. And I want to warmly encourage all our listeners to stay motivated in their English learning journey, because exploring global topics like the rise of China, the influence of the United States, the contributions of other major economies, and the multipolar structure of the world economy not only improves vocabulary and comprehension, but also builds confidence in understanding news, reading articles, and engaging with information that shapes the world, which means that every step of learning English through real-world examples is an investment in knowledge, curiosity, and global awareness that can open doors in education, careers, and communication.
Finally, we want to remind everyone that this podcast is for education and English learning only, and it is intended to provide calm, factual explanations of complex global topics without judgment, fear, or speculation, ensuring a safe and professional listening experience that aligns with YouTube's policies and encourages critical thinking, language practice, and informed discussion, which allows learners to explore world events responsibly while focusing on comprehension, vocabulary, and meaningful application in their own lives.
Yes, Adam. And as we close this episode, dear listeners, remember to stay curious, stay patient with your learning, and keep practicing English by engaging with topics that interest you. Because understanding global economics, technological developments, trade relations, and workforce trends becomes easier when combined with language skills. And by maintaining this approach, learners can grow both intellectually and linguistically, developing the confidence to read, listen, and discuss complex topics in English with clarity and accuracy.
So, Julia, as we conclude, we hope that our listeners feel both informed and inspired, understanding that global economic discussions are rich with learning opportunities, and that by combining careful analysis, structured explanations, and English practice, they can improve comprehension, strengthen vocabulary, and gain insight into the world around them, all in a safe, educational, and supportive environment that encourages thoughtful engagement rather than emotional reaction.
Exactly, Adam. And dear listeners, thank you for joining us on the English Globe today, and remember that your journey in learning English and exploring global topics is a continuous one, filled with opportunities to grow, understand, and participate meaningfully. So stay engaged, keep listening, ask questions, and use every chance to practice and improve, because knowledge, curiosity, and language skills together empower you to navigate the world confidently, responsibly, and successfully.
With that, we conclude today's episode, and we hope that our discussion has helped you understand the rise of China, the role of the United States, the influence of other global players, and what all of this means for ordinary people, while providing a safe and educational space to improve English listening, comprehension, and global awareness here on the English Globe.
Thank you, dear listeners. And until next time, stay curious, stay calm, and continue learning. Because every step you take in English brings you closer to understanding the world, participating confidently in global conversations, and growing both personally and professionally in a rapidly changing world.